Right, hi everyone. How's everyone doing? How was lunch? Wasn't lunch good? That was like the best food ever. So the scene is set, you've had an amazing lunch, you've got incredibly comfy chairs, and it's my job to try and keep you awake for the next 40 minutes or so, 30, 40 minutes. So I'm gonna do my best. And I thought about what could we do, to bring a bit of energy in the room, all that kind of stuff. And I thought we could do something very divisive, something that's gonna set people against each other like two tribes. What could that be? Who knows? What could that be? There we are, Marmite. Marmite. So apparently, according to the marketing, you either love Marmite or you hate Marmite. For the purposes of this exercise to work, you have to be one of those two. So if you're not bothered by it, you've never had it, just pick one. Okay. So we're going to take the temperature of the room on Marmite. Now, what I want you to do, don't worry. I don't want you to stand up. I don't want you to put your hands up. What I want you to do, and this is an experiment, I've never done this before, it may go horribly wrong, and it's integral to the rest of the presentation, so bear with me. I want you to hum. Okay, so you're going to hum, first of all, if you love Marmite, and then you're going to hum if you hate Marmite. Okay, so is everyone ready? Can we have a practice hum? Can we have a practice hum? This might just work. Right, okay. Okay, so if you love Marmite, hum for me now. Wow, okay. If you hate Marmite, hum for me now. Whoa, I think that's about 50-50, don't you? There we are. There we are, consensus of sorts. Right, so we'll come back to that in a second. There was a point to that. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to cast your mind back to 2008, which was 15 years ago. Feels like a long time ago. I picked some things out that are in the news. So Joe Biden was in the White House. Boris Johnson was in the headlines. He'd just become Mayor of London. Taylor Swift was the biggest pop act on the planet. And there was a massive cost of living crisis recession. So as you can see, things don't move on very quickly, which is kind of the point. Now, in 2008, I was working for a recruitment marketing agency, and I had this amazing data and analyst team. It was very difficult to recruit people for this team, and one of the guys on the team, he was South African, his visa ran out, and he was having to return to South Africa. Now, we really wanted to keep working with him, and he wanted to keep working with us. So I came to an agreement with him that he would work from home, which happened to be South Africa. Now, I thought this made perfect sense. He did spreadsheets for us. He had very, very specific outputs. We knew what he was doing. He didn't need to go to meetings. He just needed to produce this data at the right time. Now, I went to the HR department thinking this would be, A, I've saved them some recruitment money. B, there's some continuity. We're going to sort of save the problem. They would not have it. They would not believe that this guy could work from home effectively in South Africa. Because it's South Africa and he's got a swimming pool. He's not going to do any work. How are you going to watch him? What's going to happen? So I found this quite unbelievable, but everyone sort of sided with HR. So in the end, what we did, we had to set up we left his desk in the office in London. We put a webcam on it, and then he had his desk in his room in South Africa with a swimming pool in the background, with a webcam on it, and he had to work our hours facing the webcam, and the woman from HR could come by frequently to check he was still there. So sounds crazy, doesn't it? That was the prevailing attitude to let's call it hybrid work, because the rest of his team were in the office, in 2008. And as you can see by what was in the news in 2008, although it was 15 years ago and a lot's happened, not much has changed. And I would argue that actually our attitude to work hasn't changed that much either. And arguably, our attitude to work hasn't changed in 100 years. And that's why we're getting headlines like this. So, at the moment, you can't open a newspaper. How old am I? You can't open the internet without seeing a CEO somewhere making headlines about demanding that everyone returns to their office. Some of them are quite polite. So Tim Cook defends Apple's return to the office mandate. Bob Iger tells Disney employees they must return to the office 4 days a week. Then they start getting a bit crazier. IBM CEO says remote work can hurt your career. ChatGPT maker says the era of remote work is over. And then, Goldman Sachs CEO calls working from home an aberration. And then finally, Elon Musk, the star of the show at the top, who calls it morally wrong. And my favorite quote from tech CEOs is actually this one from Brian Chesky from Airbnb, who guarantees that many of these people are spending summer in the Hamptons while they're telling all their people to be back in to be back into the office. And what's interesting for me is the reasons why they're giving that people should return to the office, the reasons why hybrid and remote working is bad. Now, there's a few of them, but these are three that I've sort of picked out that come up quite a lot. So the first one is actually it's actually an anthropological concept, which is incidental information exchange. So the idea that you're sitting next to someone, you can listen to what they say, you can learn from them that way. The second one is productivity. Apparently, we're all much more productive if we're in the office. And the third one is culture, because the culture is always great in an office. It's always pizza, there's always people smiling. All those kind of, all those kind of things. These things always happen, don't they? Don't, no, they don't. Oh, wrong way. They don't wait. So my question, and really the sort of premise of this presentation is, is going back to the office the way to solve these problems? And I think that in a sense, there's a kind of a romantic view about what the office used to be like before the pandemic. But a lot of this is because it takes a very, very long time to change the way that we think. And I think what's facing us now in terms of workforces and talent and technology is we're having to challenge some very sort of deep-held assumptions. Now, there's an undertone to this about, well, actually people are being asked to go back to the office because Apple have spent a lot of money on a big building and real estate prices and all those kind of things. But actually, rather than focus on that, I want to focus on just a bit more about the office. So, is the office the best place to go back to? So, I run a podcast on the future of talent acquisition, and I was very lucky a couple of years ago to get Rory Sutherland on. If you've not come across his work, he's probably the leading thinker on behavioural science in business. And he's got some great views on all kinds of things. And I asked him we were talking about return to the work and the office and all this kind of stuff. And he came up with a great quote. I'm going to read it out. I wasn't bargaining on being this much higher than my head. But anyway, the dangers of designing for the average. The question shouldn't be what is the perfect working environment to impose on everyone for 35 hours a week. It should be what's the optimal variety we need to provide people with so they can find an environment that best suits their own cognitive style, which suits what they're trying to do at the moment. And that's why I think hybrid work is so interesting in terms of how we can be productive, where we're productive, and how we solve some of the issues that were being flagged up as a reason that everyone had to come back to the office. This was the slide that I thought was next. And a lot of the reasons behind this are really, really heavily ingrained. So I kind of picked these three men as helping to kind of embed the DNA of how we work. So industrialist Robert Owen, he was the inventor of the 8-hour day in 1817. And the idea was 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure, 8 hours sleep, which I believe adds up to 24. And then Henry Ford credited with inventing the 5-day week. Douglas McGregor, you probably come across him, who's a management theorist, and his theory of X and Y about motivation, what motivates people at work. And the theory of Y is that, theory X is that people are inherently untrustworthy and selfish and won't do any work unless you watch them. Now, all of these things came from a good place at the time, but actually this is the DNA of how we think about work right now. Some of it's over 100 years old. So I think the next few years we're going to have to really ask a lot of questions about work and what it means to us and how we do it. And it's a difficult process. And that's why we have CEOs calling for people to get back to the office. So, let's think about the benefits of hybrid and remote. These have all come from people that I've spoken to on the podcast. So, first of all, accessing a larger pool of talent with diverse backgrounds and experiences, flexibility and inclusion, engagement and productivity. That's what the companies that I've been speaking to who either work completely remotely or work in a hybrid way, they're the advantages that they're coming forward with. So, it's incredibly important. How does this argument resolve itself? It's a bit like a pantomime. We're going back to the office. Oh, yes, you are. Oh, no, we're not, et cetera, et cetera. Probably three things. I think ultimately productivity and business performance. If a business is performing really well with a remote team and one of its competitors has everyone back at the office, is that a comparison? I think that could be interesting. Internal mobility and career progression, particularly in hybrid companies. If we study in 2 or 3 years' time who got promoted, were they people who were in the office all the time? Were they people who had that proximity to their manager? I think there's some interesting data to sort of be had there. But ultimately, it's going to be the workers that decide. Attracting and retaining talent. People will vote with their feet for the type of working arrangement that they want. But it's going to take a very long time for this to settle down and for the argument to get a bit more serious about a bit more serious than it is now. So 2 things I want to kind of dig into. Reinventing the way we work and thinking differently about talent, because I think they're key to how we move forward. So, reinventing how we work. Whenever new technology comes along, a new platform, a new way of working, we go through 3 stages. We transfer what we did in the past to the new technology. Then we start to adapt what we do, because the new technology gives us other options. And then it drives a revolution in what we do. So the example I want to use here is office communication. So looking around the room, it's not going to be very many people. Who remembers a time before email in the office? Okay. Yeah, it did happen. It did happen. So I don't know if you remember, I don't know if you work for a company like this, but if someone wanted to communicate something within the business, they print out a bit of paper, a memo, they put it on everyone's desk. There'd be a distribution list and a CC list, and that's how we got our information. Then email came along, and we just transferred that into email. So that's why email has CC and blind CC and all this kind of stuff. Gradually, we adapted, and we realized that you can use the CC box as a political tool in terms of who you CC. And you can use the timestamp on the email as a demonstration of your productivity by sending an email at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. But eventually, and all these things do still exist, but now we're seeing a revolution in terms of Slack and WhatsApp and lots of different ways of communicating that are also driving different ways of working. CC is really interesting. Hum, if you know what CC stands for. Okay, carbon copy, all right. Has anyone actually used a carbon copy or know what a carbon copy is? A couple of people, a few people. Okay, there we are. It's kind of a bit of carbon used to put between 2 bits of paper and a typewriter, isn't it? So you could do it. So I like to call things like the fact that we still say this is CC, workplace archaeology, basically, because it bears no relation to its original form, but it's still used. And a bit like these kind of diagrams. So anyone under the age of, I was going to say 40, but I'm going to have to say 30, thinks that's just the save button and not one of those annoying plastic discs that you used to put in computers. Likewise, telephones don't really look like that, and certainly your iPhone that you make a call on doesn't look like that. Files and folders, we still kind of have those, but not the same. So workplace archaeology in terms of thinking about how things have changed. So we need to think about what happened when the pandemic arrived. Is we went into that transfer thing. My wife has a proper job, unlike me, and she was on Teams at 9 o'clock every morning because they had to have a call at 9 o'clock every morning just to check that no one had gone anywhere in a pandemic when you were locked down. And then that's kind of transformed into, death by Teams and death by Zoom and all these kind of things. So we sort of transferred the ways of working where we were all in an office. And we're only starting to sort of adapt to the hybrid world that we live in. But we kind of need to go through that process of adaptation and then revolution to really, be productive, have happy people, and get the most out of what we do. I'm going to sort of pull up a lot of slides that refer to specific podcast episodes of my podcast because I always find that useful to do because I think then you can actually hear from the people who did this rather than me sort of reporting them. So one of the things that I've done on the podcast ever since the pandemic hit is talk to people who run remote-first companies. So these are companies who've never had an office. These are companies who've always been remote. And they've been around for ages and ages and ages. And what's really interesting is they have very different ways of working. And it's those kind of things that I think we can learn from in terms of hybrid businesses, in terms of hybrid businesses moving forward. So this is Lizzie and Alex, who run a company called Hoxby. They've written a book called Work Style, all about the way that they work. It's a great book. And they work on these kind of 3 A's, so asynchronous, autonomy, and accountability. So they work asynchronously, which means they don't have lots of Teams meetings to discuss things. They have shared documents. They have ways of communicating. They have employees all over the world, so they kind of time shift that communication in terms of how they work. They have autonomy. People can do what they like, but with autonomy, they have accountability. So everyone is very clear about what they're going to deliver. And to me, this was exactly what I was trying to do with my South African data analyst in 2008. It was all about he could work asynchronously if he wanted to. He had autonomy, but that came with accountability. So that's one great example. Another one from Customer I/O. This is quite a recent interview. So again, they were talking about how they manage their business remotely and really focusing on, actually, they think that drives innovation for them because it opens up talent pools in different parts of the world. It brings people into their business who wouldn't work for them if they were based in an office. So there's that kind of diversity of thought that gives them sort of different thinking. They're very big on community and connection. And when they're face-to-face, it's about being intentional face-to-face. Now, I keep hearing lots of stories about people being dragged into the office to do Zoom calls with people who are not in the office. So it's kind of like, if we're working in these hybrid ways, there are things that, as humans, we can only do face-to-face. How do we kind of maximize those, and how do you maximize those in your workforce? Humming. What was that humming thing about? This was an example that I found from, it's a group of volunteers. I think they're called the Internet Engineering Fellowship of something. And they basically decide a lot of the protocols around the internet. The most terrifying thing about the internet when you really look into it is it's actually run by volunteers. And basically they have to make lots of decisions about things that they do. And what they do is they hum to see if they've got consensus. So in our Marmite experiment, we were kind of 50-50, or maybe even 48-52, the world's worst division. And they would go on talking until it was very clear that they had consensus. But actually, by doing that, you're not asking people to raise their hands, and you don't know necessarily who's humming. So that's something you can only do face-to-face. So I think that this is about really rethinking what we do when we get face-to-face, and actually having everyone in the office all the time is not necessarily the best way to do that. This particular company, Sophie works for a company called Worktrip, and they're like Airbnb for business away days. Now, I'm sure many of you have been on a business offsite. In fact, this probably counts as, does this count as one business offsite? Not quite, nearly. And you go on a business offsite and you go to the basement of a hotel that looks a bit like your office. It was probably normally organized by the office manager at the last minute because someone told them to, and it's not very good. So, what a lot of companies are saying is like, okay, we'll work hybrid, we'll work remote, then we'll do these lovely offsites and bring people together, but then aren't really thinking about what that looks like. So what Worktrip does is it helps people with different, interesting venues to get people together in. And really, it's all about being memorable, creating a memorable experience for people, but also the relationship between environment and how people think and how productive they are and what mode they're in, which kind of goes back to what Rory Sutherland was saying about offices. It's like, what do you want to get out of this, and how do you provide the environment to do it? And again, it's about being intentional and designing something. Sometimes people go to the other thing. I remember once being taken to a brilliant offsite in Wales, where we just went to the National Climbing Centre and fell off climbing ropes for 2 days. I've got no idea what that had to do with my job. In fact, it wasn't even that much fun. So it's thinking about that kind of intentionality about, if we're working hybrid, how do you bring people together to do it? I'm going to skip on actually because I've gone on a very long time. So I just want to get back to talk about. I was going to talk about ChatGPT and AI and how that also changes everything in terms of how we work. However, the iteration we see of it now isn't where we're going to end up. So we have to think about where we're going to end up in a few years' time and how's that going to affect the way that we work. Let's talk about talent for the last bit. So thinking differently about talent. In one of my books, Digital Talent, which I wrote with the highly talented Mervyn Dinnan, who's over there, who's actually sitting there to make sure I credit him and don't claim I wrote it all myself. We wrote about something called total talent thinking, which was thinking about your workforce as a whole, whether that's internal mobility, talent attraction, contract work, project workers, coming together as a collection of people with skills to deliver things. And what we talked about in the book is actually, as an employer, if you don't treat those people the same, then you're not going to get the best out of them. So there's a whole way of thinking about talent differently. So, the talent that you have might not necessarily work for you. It might just be working for you on that one project. The talent could be AI. It's a combination of different skill sets to deliver what you need. And really, in this world where we can do this, in this kind of hybrid world where we can bring different skills together from all around the world and technologies and things like that, skills are the key building blocks to this. So huge amounts of talk about skills-based hiring and understanding the skills in your business. And I think it's a critical thing as we kind of move into the future because, understanding how you access skills, even if that's in a unconventional way, is kind of critical in terms of optimizing that hybrid workforce. Now, with that, we have to think differently about recruitment. So it's really interesting that I think people are already seeing this, that ChatGPT is writing CVs for people, it's doing online tests. It's an aberration. How could it possibly do that? And there are three ways of looking at this. There are three things to blame. You could blame the candidate, the talent, but are they not just being resourceful and using the tools that they have available? You can blame the AI, and it is the AI's fault, but it's not going away, is it? So that's not going to work. Or you can blame the process. And how do we think differently about a recruitment process to surface the skills that we need in a way that that's going to work for us? And it's interesting, and I think there's a very long way to go. There's a very, very long way to go with this. But some of the tech that interested me the most at the moment is all the assessment tech that's appearing. So the ability to assess people for lots of different things, soft skills, all these kind of things. And it's a really kind of booming area. There's a lot of conversations to have around it in terms of, validity, science, how does it work, how does it fit into recruiting? But it's really interesting. And then if you kind of stretch a little bit further out into the future, if we've got these tools whereby people can measure and validate their skills in a different way, I'm really interested by this startup, which is called CV Wallet, which basically has formed loads of alliances with some of those partners. And it allows the person, the job seeker, to take control of their own sort of assessment tests, to put them on the blockchain to validate them, and then move around and say, this is me. These are the skills that I have. I can work on this project. I can work for your business. So driving some really interesting things in terms of the evolution of recruitment. This is all very, very early stage. I think most organizations that you talk to, even those that talk about skills, haven't still quite mastered how to measure the skills they have in their business or what that means. But I think this is the direction that all of this is going to. And hybrid work is really fueling that because it opens up so many more possibilities when you look past that narrow, we need to get everyone back in the office kind of thinking. A really interesting interview with this guy about fractional talent. So, everyone talking about fractional hiring and fractional talent at the moment. I thought it was just another word for interim or contract. But actually, when you sort of dig down to people who are doing it in really interesting ways, there's something more to it. It's kind of like, hiring a marketing director permanently, but then sharing them with lots of other people. And I think this new ways of thinking about talent, accessing skills on demand, it's a real mindset shift in terms of how we think about recruiting and how we think about talent. And I think these are the things that we need to be discussing and we need to be thinking about. And I don't have a huge amount of answers about it, but I just know that it's something that's going on. The other thing that I've seen, and I've seen this from a lot of companies, is for this to work, you can't have the traditional silos in HR. So, you can't have talent management and L&D and talent acquisition just being run separately and not talking to each other. And lots of organizations are starting to bring them closer together. And also with things like AI that you could just power and analyze data across a whole HR function, why would you have them separately? And I think, during the pandemic, lots of TA teams started to work on internal mobility, but there's still a very long way to go. Those silos are still there in HR. And there's an interview with Debbie from Pax8, who's a VP of talent, who looks after all of these things. And in this interview, she talks about how she's trying to pull them together from a skills perspective. What skills do we have in the business? What skills do we need to grow in the business? What skills do we need to hire into the business? What skills do we need to borrow into the business? So really interesting thinking going on. And then finally, almost finally, this whole aspect of neurodiversity. So had a great conversation with Ed about neuroinclusion. Now, 20% of the world's population are estimated to be neurodivergent. And only 3 to 5% of those people actually have a diagnosis. So within your organization, there are huge amounts of different brains. There may be people who have some kind of formal neurodivergence, or just people who think differently. And I think that when you're thinking about how you work, being neuro-inclusive and really tapping into the different brains and different ways of working within your organization is absolutely critical. And hybrid work gives us the opportunity to do that, because people can work where they're productive and work in different ways. And I think having that flexibility of thinking and not relying on a 100-year-old 8-hour day or a 80-year-old 5-day week or whatever it was, really is the sort of the way forward. And then my final point about skills, we've just got these huge skills crisis that are coming up on us. So James Withers recently wrote a report for the Scottish Government, and I'm going to have him on the podcast soon. And I live in Scotland. I don't sound Scottish, obviously, because I'm not, but I live there. Scotland is always very interesting because it's kind of a bit of a microcosm. You can analyse things because it's got a smaller population. So the Scottish Government commissioned him to look at skills in Scotland. They said, do you know what, in 10, 20 years' time, we're all about net zero, life sciences, green technology. What's our skills ecosystem look like? So he looked at companies, he looked at further education, he looked at skills, he looked at what business wanted, and he just found an unholy mess, which means that, despite the best intentions of that's where our industries are in the future, there isn't a skills strategy that drives it forward. And I think there's a big part that employers have to play in terms of thinking about how we get the skills for the future. So I think that's a whole nother area. So, final thoughts. Lots of stuff there. I think the key thing is that the road ahead is very uncertain. So if I was doing this a few months ago, I'd be quoting all the reports and the quotes that said by June we'd all be out of a job because of generative AI. But we're still here. And in fact, I haven't read it yet, but I saw that yesterday KPMG published a report that said actually generative AI is not going to affect anyone's job or very few people's jobs. So the rules are constantly going to change. That'll change tomorrow. The technology is going to change tomorrow. So we're on a very kind of uncertain road. So we need flexibility of thinking. But more than anything else, we need to challenge things that are long-held assumptions that we just accept. And I think that's sort of the key message, that if you want to really get the advantages that the pandemic's given us in terms of hybrid and remote working, we have to challenge the way that we think about work. And that is quite difficult to do. So good luck and thank you.